Good afternoon. I'm Callum Carmichael. I'm the director of the School of Public Policy and Administration, and I would like to acknowledge that the university, including the beautiful Ridgecraft Hall in which we're situated, is located on unceded Algonquin territory. And I'd also like to welcome you and to say how much of a pleasure it is to welcome you to this fifth Celebrating Philanthropy. It is an annual public event that takes place during our 2-week summer institute for the students in our graduate programs in philanthropy and nonprofit leadership. It's through these graduate programs that the school seeks to strengthen the sector by investing in the people who are working in or with it or who aspire to do so. And let me tell you, on the basis of knowing the 60 students in the room today, there is much to be confident and celebrate in. And then we are so grateful to have people recognize the importance of the sector and their potential to contribute to their societies through it. Thank you. It has been a pleasure to be in your company daily over the past 2 weeks. Through Celebrating Philanthropy and other such events like our Philanthropic series, the school hopes to link our teaching and research with the experience of people in the sector, believing that by combining academic and applied perspectives, all of us can develop a better analytical ability, a better understanding of the many contributions that the sector can make, whether in meeting human needs or fostering human development or enriching human lives, and of the ways in which those contributions can be measured, maintained, and improved. So whether you are working in the sector, studying it, or doing research in that area, your presence here is really important. Thank you for coming. By way of introducing today's theme, I need to make a confession. I don't play hockey. I don't even like poutine. I have never been to Florida. But I do have one claim to one Canadian trait, and that is to have a predisposition to compare our circumstances with what is going on south of the 49th. Sometimes these comparisons can make me feel inferior, sometimes superior, but sometimes it can identify aspects or developments that help me better understand what is going on in Canada, what might be going on in Canada. And it's that purpose that we're going to be making a comparison today. Canadians with an interest in philanthropy in the nonprofit sector recognize that in the States now, there are many developments that are unfolding as we speak, not simply in politics, but in philanthropy and nonprofits. Some of these developments could be specific and confined to our southern neighbor, but others might be what we might think of as being canaries, early signals of international trends or what might become a contagion for Canada. What can we learn from the States as to what might be happening here? And we look to our panel today to provide us with some answers to that, to scan and get a better understanding of the developments in the U.S., and to explore their implications, if any, for philanthropy and the nonprofit sector here in Canada. And to help us do this, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Susan Phillips, the supervisor of our Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership Program, to introduce our panel and moderate our proceedings. Susan.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's certainly a timely topic, and we have a great panel to speak on this subject. I will provide very brief introductions and apologize to you in advance that I will not do you credit by your many accomplishments with the very brief introduction that I'm going to provide. We start with William Brown, who is our International Visiting Scholar during the Summer Institute. Will is the Mary Julia and George Gordon Professor and Director of the Nonprofit Management in the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. He's a prolific scholar on the topic of nonprofit management and a close observer of developments in the U.S. Welcome, Will. Joanne Ryan is Vice President Philanthropy, TD Wealth, and Executive Director of the Private Giving Foundation. In this role, Joanne has a bird's eye view on what private philanthropists are thinking and how private philanthropy might be growing and changing, and she personally has led some really important work on women and philanthropy. My colleague Nathan Grasse joined our School of Public Policy and Administration in this program as assistant professor 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
He is an import from the U.S., where he's taught at several universities, so he's seen both sides of the border. And Nathan's been paying particular attention to financing of nonprofits and charities. And Hilary Pearson has sat on many, many boards, currently does, knows this sector well, is president and CEO of Philanthropic Foundations of Canada, and she can really speak to what's going on in more institutionalized philanthropy. Welcome all. We give them then our format is to give them a very brief, a ridiculously brief period of time, given the complexity of the subject. Each makes some opening statements. We'll have a conversation among ourselves. They can rebut each other. They can agree. They can make further audacious statements. Then we'll open it to you for questions and comments, and then some wrap-up statements. So, Will, do you want to get us started by what's going through? Some of us have been glued to CNN, but there's more than what's going on, with your tweeting president.
Yes. I'm not sure I can keep up with all of that, but thank you, Susan. I'll provide some thoughts or some perspectives on what I see going on with philanthropy, nonprofits. A lot of my work tends to be with localized, so it is sort of from that lens as well. I work with a variety of kinds of organizations running a similar program to what you have here. We're aware of the sort of socio-political environment that's going on, right, in the political context and the polarization that's very real. And you see it in a variety of different places and in a variety of different ways. But there does seem to be some unprecedented unassemblage, if you will, or taking apart of many institutions and sort of regulatory structures. And I think that's really been going on for a long time. There has been a lot of sort of political effort to try and figure out how do we mitigate some of these governing structures that have served us for a number of years. So that's a very real, and being in Texas, we see it there as well. An active, our legislative bodies are back in session now to talk about both some regulatory action, but also mechanisms by which they can, control or sustain the modest investment in a variety of initiatives that go on in the state. So there's those flavors that go on. As we think about sort of the nonprofit context of operating within that, we hear consistently a sort of a lack of coherency to the social network or the social frame or the social structure within communities in a variety of ways. So you think a local community like mine, Bryan College Station, which is about 90 miles north of Houston, a community of about 150,000 folks. The nature of the social service delivery networks that exist and operate there are surprisingly disparate and independent in the nature that they are. And I feel that that's more so now. And yet you see, partly because of the governing structure, the institutions that perhaps we used to look to that would establish and put those things in place. So the cities no longer are perceived of, or the counties, I'm originally from California, where you might see the counties acting in a way that created this sort of network or connectedness and brought people together. So you look to philanthropy in a way, but at the same time, the philanthropic institutions are not necessarily positioned or appreciate the need for that coherency or some sense of structure or connectedness. So it's really a fascinating place. You're talking to nonprofit executives that are trying to do a variety of work, community foundation executives, and no clear sense about how you mitigate some of the fundamental social challenges that we confront. So there are a number of social issues that we have to address, healthcare continuing to be one for us in the States, but just general access to services, poverty, and how you break the cycle of poverty. And yet there is no a way to sort of address those, and again, at a localized, and I think part of it's driven by some of the national and subnational influences that happen in the political context. Maybe that's enough to get us started, and sort of I could say more, but I think that probably is enough and leaves room for the rest of you to play in some of that. Is that okay?
Sure. So is it fair to say that we're seeing a much more fragmented system with big holes in it and not okay?
Summarize.
Okay.
She did that to me this afternoon too, so I appreciate it a bunch.
Joanne, you have a great view of what's going on here, particularly with personal philanthropy.
Sure. Well, I guess I just wanted to say we've been reading a lot of doom and gloom about how the number of donors in Canada is shrinking. In fact, KCI said that the percentage of Canadians giving to charity between 2004 and now has dropped from 85 to 82%. 82%. So what I want to say is that there's some problems with using data from Stats Canada. So when we report what Canadians are giving, that information comes from the income tax forms that we file. And there's a few problems with that. One, donations can be pooled between spouses. So really saying the donor pool is shrinking, it could be that really one spouse or common law partner is claiming more of them. Donations can be spread and claimed over 6 years. So just because they're not reporting them in one particular year doesn't mean that you're not particularly making them. We've also had CRA crack down on some tax shelter schemes that perhaps really inflated what the donation numbers were. These are schemes where people were getting donation receipts up to 3 to 4 times the value of what their actual donation was. So the fact that we have been able to or CRA has been able to shut that down and maybe is making the total donations a little bit lower is actually a good thing. And I also think that we're seeing people donate today in ways that don't generate tax receipts. We're seeing crowdfunding, and people are donating from their cell phones by texting. People are investing in social enterprises as an alternative way. So I think it's not as doom and gloom as what is being reported, and that Canadians are stepping up. Certainly, when disasters strike in Canada, for $165 million was raised by the Red Cross to help with the Fort McMurray fires, and more money is currently being poured in right now to help with the BC fires. I noticed in the U.S. Giving was up in 2016, and it wasn't due to fire, flood, and natural disasters. In fact, according to Giving USA, many individuals increased nearly 4% in 2016 in the U.S. And really, we're thinking there's maybe the political uncertainty is causing people in the U.S. to give more generously, or they're treating your current political situation as a natural disaster, where they're coming forward and they're actually
We
giving.
couldn't resist.
You don't need fires and floods to incent the U.S. donors to give more. So in Canada, we have a generous tax incentives to give. In fact, our finance minister has commissioned a study to see if we're actually too generous in the tax incentives that Canadians have to give. And while our tax incentives are generous, obviously you're still out of pocket at the end of the day. So you do have to have that philanthropic intent. The makeup in Canada today of our high net worth clients, which are our high net worth donors, have changed. 15 or 20 years ago, if we were dealing with high net worth clients, there was a good chance it was family money or inherited money. And today, over 2/3 of high net net worth clients are self-made in Canada, maybe even approaching 3/4. So they haven't learned from previous generations about philanthropy, but they're smart, they've made a lot of money, and they want to use their business and entrepreneurial skills to make a measurable impact. We're seeing intergenerational wealth transfer, putting a lot of money into the flow into philanthropy. We know that women have a longer life expectancy than men, and so they end up with a lot of money at the end of the day and are very, 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 very philanthropic. And then finally, a trend in Canada that certainly we did copy from the US, which I'm very involved in, is donor advised funds, which is the simple alternative to establishing your own foundation. And in the US, Fidelity was the pioneer back in 1992, which is a huge driving force, and a number followed suit. So we at TD, we launched the Private Giving Foundation in 2004 as the first financial institution to launch a donor advised fund program. And again, just as in the US, many other financial institutions have followed suit. We think there's well over $1 billion assets in these funds, but the more important thing, it's not what the assets are in the funds, it's that this represents a really growing source of revenue that is now available to flow into the charitable sector. And that's good news.
Great. Nathan, you've seen both sides of the border.
Yeah,
How do you make comparisons?
It's true, and I was thinking about the subject that I might broach with you this afternoon, and I was either going to focus on the regulatory mechanisms of political activity of charities, which Will's already mentioned, or I was going to focus on big data, open data. And I'm glad that Will talked about the regulatory mechanisms breaking down in the States, because that means I don't have to, because I find it a bit depressing. And instead I'm going to talk about something I think that is a cause for optimism in both countries, and that is the fact that there's going to be a lot of data sources that become available and allow for greater transparency, improved decision making, and I think they're happening in both countries, but what's unique about the Canadian situation is that there are more resources readily available, which is not to say the environment is perfect, but that we have an opportunity to make incredible progress in relatively short order and possibly be a world leader in this area. So if I give you a short history of a project that I've been working on in the US that is dovetailed into some efforts here in Canada, there was a lawsuit being brought against the IRS in the States, which is of course one of the main regulators of our charitable and nonprofit organizations, about making tax data publicly available. The suit was brought by a gentleman named Carl Marmoud, and he had sued before to get SEC data made available so that we could know more about for-profit organizations. The IRS became aware of the case and realized its likely disposition, and then where they weren't forced to do so by a court order, but they preemptively released some data. And the charitable research community was thrilled by this, and charities were also excited because some of the tax data from organizations that were filing electronically was now supposedly going to be publicly available, easy to access, right, completely free. And we thought, this is solving a tremendous problem for us. Organizations, academics, we're all going to be able to know so much more and very easily about charities and some other nonprofits. Well, the IRS is resource constrained in the US, and therefore they were forced to or chose to release the data in a format that was fundamentally unusable for most charities or even academic researchers. It was dumped out in a format that's XML. If you're not a computer scientist, you have no reason to care what that is, but it means that all the information is basically in a list, and it comes with a label, but it's not particularly helpful. Because the research community was frustrated by this development, a colleague of mine and I decided we were going to try to solve the problem, and we worked on this e-filed tax data. So they're electronically filing their returns, and we found a way to collect it, at least a good portion of it, and then disseminate it so it was available for research. And we're working on some functions for public reporting and use. From those conversations, we started to think more about other data sources that are publicly available and open in the US that we could use with this e-file data, and what it would mean for us to make connections with these big data sources and how much we could learn about where organizations were getting money and how they were building their capacity and how that capacity was influencing outcomes. So on the U.S. side, there's a working group now with many of the major players at charitable and governmental organizations working in collaboration, at least so far, to build capacity in this area and make these connections. And I think if we can make some kind of public-facing technology, we can make a big advance in short order, even in the U.S. What I've really been impressed by here in Canada is that there seems to be more data to which we'll be able to gain access in short order. So the tax data here in Canada coming from the CRA and the Charities Directorate is already at a higher degree of integrity, and it's available more broadly, covering a higher percentage of the organization. So just from the purpose of from the point of view of the tax data, we're in a much better position. But also there's a movement among governmental organizations to release data related to grants and contracts, funding. I mean, that could include performance indicators, etc. I've only been in a few meetings related to this, but when I see the amount of detail and granularity related to some of this contract, grants and contract data, I'm amazed, because you think of the potential implications. And the more that I learn from working with a group here in Canada with a similar focus, the more I become aware of other things we might be able to use as a sector to improve our decision making. So again, I think one of the things that causes me to be optimistic about the sector in both countries, but particularly here in Canada, is the potential availability of all of this data. And if we can invest a bit into some infrastructure, I think there could be some primary usage for charitable and nonprofit organizations directly from these mechanisms, and then opportunities for firms that work with these organizations to add a layer of function on top of it that will really be able to improve transparency, decision making, etc. Help government and other funders to make decisions, and to help organizations make decisions about their own programs and outcomes. So I wanted to focus on something positive, and I think that it's a cause for optimism in both countries, but particularly here in Canada, I think we're poised potentially to make great strides in relatively short order. So it's one of the few areas involving the U.S. I could take a positive tact. So there's my effort.
Well done. And Nathan and colleagues are doing some great work around aggregating that data and making sense of it. Hilary, you look more at institutionalized philanthropy. What do you see in that space?
Well, I'm going to pick up on the phrase, canary in the coal mine. To reflect a bit on what's happening in the States around organized philanthropy and see if there are some things that we should be paying more attention to in Canada. They may be canaries that are actually positive canaries.
That'd be great.
But they are also going to be, I think there are some negative canaries, some drop-dead canaries, so I think we should be paying attention to this. I'll keep it short because I know, Susan, you want to get us into a conversation, but I guess I want to make 3 points. And again, these are things that are based on my observations of American philanthropy, American organized philanthropy, so by that I mean the foundation sector, basically. Large foundations, small foundations. As we know, a huge, huge sector in the United States. $865 billion, I think, was the last data point on assets of that sector. I mean, phenomenal numbers, right? But it's not a happy picture. And the first point I want to make really is I think the pressure that organized philanthropy is feeling around this question of the social license to operate. Part of it is related to the same set of issues that probably led to the election of the Republicans and Trump. I don't want to really get into a lot of talk about Trump, although we may inevitably do that. But, the social license to operate of foundations is one that is fragile. It's not, you can't take it as given. It's not because you're a charitable foundation that you are therefore going to get a pass, that you are going to be the good guy. And part of the reason why I think there's some pressure now on the social license to operate of foundations is a phenomenon that you could say is a positive one, the prominence of very large donors. We've had some extraordinary gifts made, and I think most of you would know them. The whole Silicon Valley crowd, Chan Zuckerberg, and the rest, who are playing an enormous role in American philanthropy today, not necessarily choosing to set up a foundation either to do it. Chan Zuckerberg it's an initiative. It's not a foundation. It's a limited liability corporation. There are new developments structurally, I think, in American philanthropy that are being driven by these very large, very visible donors. And while it's good that this money is being apparently devoted to public benefit or to the sort of public good, there is also a sense in which these large donors are tempting fate because they're quite ambitious in their expectations and in their goals. They think that they can change public education in the United States. They think that they can fix, perhaps they don't think they can fix healthcare, because I don't know if anybody can fix healthcare, but they think that they can have big impact. One might grant that Bill Gates and Melinda Gates can have big impact, but even they are, and their massive foundation, are not rivaling government financial flows. So to think that you could have major impact on public policy is ambitious, and it draws the attention, I think, of people in the United States who are feeling, and this gets us to the question of inequality, who are feeling very resentful. Inequality, as we know, in the United States has been growing, and there are very many people in the United States looking at these visible, ambitious donors who want to make big changes in public systems, and I think are asking some questions. Who are these people, and why should they get to do this really without much accountability to anybody? Bill and Melinda Gates, as far as I know, still only have 3 or 4 people on their board, being Bill and Melinda, and Bill's father, and possibly, I don't know if they've added more people recently, but fundamentally, these are not truly accountable organizations, not in the way that a government is, or that a public company is even. So there's a whole set of issues there around the social license to operate, which I think are going to become more difficult over time, and they may come to Canada. Canadian foundations have had a pass. On the whole, we do still benefit from this notion that if you're a charitable foundation, you're probably out there doing good, and you should be given the benefit of the doubt. And there isn't a whole lot of social critique of the role of philanthropy and the role of philanthropic organizations yet. You see it in Quebec. It is happening in Quebec. And that's because you see a very large visible donor, the Chagnon Foundation, which tried to do something very ambitious in changing healthcare and, well, not healthcare, but childcare systems in conjunction with the government of Quebec in a way that brought the unions out, that brought community organizations out, that brought a lot of people out to say, who the hell are these people? Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have said that, right? That's okay. Sorry, take that back. But there is that possibility that this could happen in Canada as foundations get larger, more visible, and more ambitious. That's point number one. The second point is a point around, and this relates to very much to, I think, electoral outcomes and the suspicion of elitism, populism. What is driving populism in the United States today? What has led to these surprising political developments? Well, clearly a great suspicion of the 1%. And the difference between the 1% and the 99% in the United States is enormous for various reasons that we know. Perhaps not as great in Canada. We don't have quite the inequality, largely because we have the income support systems that we know about and that I think Canadians are still very strongly married to. But the attack on privilege, the concern about privilege, I think is really having an impact within the organized philanthropy space. So foundations are really worried about this. And when I say foundations, I should stop myself because I just said this earlier to Will. There are different groups, even within philanthropy in the United States, there's an ideological divide. There are blue foundations and red foundations, and they go to different meetings and they talk about different things and they talk to each other and not across. Therefore, I have to say, when I'm making this statement about American philanthropy, that has to be taken into account. I would say that the progressive middle in American philanthropy continues to be larger, probably, than the conservative margin. But that being said, it's still, there are some real debates that are going on. Now, within the progressive middle, and this is a third point I want to make, there is a very, I guess, the only thing I can say about this is it seems like a very internally focused but very anxiety-ridden debate about whether foundations are listening properly. What voices are they hearing? Are they out there? What was their role, for example, in the whole election campaign last year? Not in the sense of did they participate in the campaign, but the role that they play in representing privilege and representing the elite. To what extent did that inflame views? And what extent are they as foundations more accountable than most institutions for listening better, listening more effectively, getting out there, getting more diversity into at their board table? I mean, the number of conversations that I have been at in American philanthropy conferences in the past year on the question of diversity, inclusion, who's there and who's not there, how can we get them there, and of course the issue of race, always the issue of race in the United States, black-white, always black-white, it's there, and it's strong, and it's still, and even more so, I think, on the table. Are these issues happening and being discussed in Canada? Not as much, but I still think there's a canary here. I think that Canada has to pay more attention. Canada is so much more diverse as a country than it was, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. But foundations are white on the whole. And so these issues of privilege and of inclusion and of how you listen better, I think are issues that we have to pay attention to. My last point is a point about disruption. I keep waiting for the foundation sector to be fundamentally disrupted the way every other sector is being by everything we know about technology, social media, the ways in which people are connecting with each other. And I think it's beginning to happen. I must say, I find that the foundation model has been surprisingly iceberg-like, but we're now maybe beginning to see the Larson shelf kind of split off here. Things are changing, and they're going to change fast. I was telling Nathan earlier that I was fascinated to see just last month a new site. It's an internet site called Grant Advisor. So we all know about TripAdvisor, right? You want to go on TripAdvisor to find out which hotels are worth staying at, and what you should and should not do when you go on a trip. Well, we now have Grant Advisor. So you can go onto this site and you can look up foundations. And these foundations have been reviewed presumably by grantees, but potentially also by people who were refused a grant, people who simply are interested in a foundation and have had some sort of interaction with that foundation, maybe people in the media. It's a fascinating new way of using technology in a very democratic way to get at the question of who these foundations are and how they operate and how people perceive them. And there's a dashboard for each foundation. If you go on the site, you'll find it. There's a dashboard that tells you, broadly speaking, what the weight of opinion is on whether this foundation is accessible, what the nature of the experience was. It's a bit like being rated as a hotel, What was it like? Was it comfortable? Were there bed bugs? Would you never stay in this place again? We're going to be seeing this kind of thing happening more and more. So it's not an option for foundations to be private. It's not an option for foundations to think that they can somehow not be transparent and open about their decision making, about their practices. It's going to put the onus on them. And we combine that pressure with the pressure that is felt at a more political and even a moral level in terms of what are we organizations of privilege, what do we owe to society, and what do we need to do to maintain our social license to operate. I think we're going to start seeing some very big changes. So that's a positive note, because I think most of those changes are going to be good. I suppose, and the last thing I'll say, one scenario would be that 25 years from now, basically there aren't any more foundations, or the only ones that are left are dinosaurs, because a lot of people are going to move away from that model. So institutional philanthropy may well still be organized, but it's not going to be organized in the way we see it today. We may not see foundations. We may not see, certainly not foundations that are organized in perpetuity. We may see pools of money that are being put to public use by private individuals. But it'll be very interesting for me to see, what it looks like 25 years from now. If I could come back as a canary or a fly on the wall, I'd be fascinated to see what it's going to look like.
I want to pick up on that idea of social license to operate. And that was not exactly the stirring defense of foundations that I would have expected.
Oh, I can defend foundations, no problem. I can come back on that.
But first of all, a question for you, Joanne. Do you see Canadians of high net worth making larger gifts, as we've seen in the U.S., and we're seeing that critique of foundations, but we're seeing even more of donor-advised funds in terms of transparency and all of that. So do we see donors making bigger gifts and holding on to control of the gift in a greater way in Canada?
So we are seeing large gifts. I will say another difference between the United States and Canada is that Canadians are quieter and often don't want a lot of the fanfare to brag about their giving, even though we do encourage that it's a great example. So we're seeing not maybe the mega gifts, but we're seeing some very large gifts. And often when it's a very large gift, there is some type of tax motivation. They've sold a business or something that you want to do to offset tax in a particular year. But what is changing that Hilary alluded to is yes, they're going into donor advised funds because it's simple and it's easy, it offsets the tax, and then you can take the time to thoughtfully decide how to allocate those funds. But we've seen a real trend towards the traditional endowment, to everything from flexible endowments to spend down endowments. So as an example, the Private Giving Foundation, the disbursement quota is 3.5%, which has to be distributed to charity each year. We have probably been averaging 25%. So there isn't this notion of just invest the capital and pay off 3.5% per year, and that's enough, because I'm finding that donors are feeling that in perpetuity or forever is just too long. They don't even want to hear the word. They want to know that it's a charitable fund that they're putting their money in, that they can then thoughtfully distribute in the time frame that is important to them. So, they are generous and they are making large gifts. They're just doing it a little quieter than some of our friends south of the border.
I want to pick up on the social license to operate as it applies to nonprofits. We've seen, as I read it, a debate coming out of the U.S. about the question of whether they're really nonprofit. The criticism is often levied at Harvard, which has a $35 billion endowment, Yale at $25 billion, Texas A&M at $10.5. Carleton's is slightly lower than that. But we're seeing it of hospitals as well, asking what's the difference. You have such in reserves. What's the difference between how you operate and a for-profit? And all of the questions about what really is the essence of nonprofit. What does it mean anymore? Am I reading some of those debates in the U.S. correctly, Will, or how do you see some of those issues playing out?
Yeah, I think we could talk about higher education. I mean, and where it plays out. I think healthcare, hospitals, and the role of hospitals and how hospitals have shifted the commercial pressures that hospitals, what we see happening with community hospitals, for instance, right, where the financial pressures of operating and being able to sustain operations and the need for professional management, and yet back to sort of fragmentation, thinking about what happens in rural areas when a community hospital becomes a part of a broader system, where I think in a lot of ways the community hospitals did represent the nature of what it meant to be a philanthropic or a charitable organization that was organized to provide services in a sophisticated way. Yeah, it's an interesting question, really is, about how does part of, how does some of that, I don't know if it's all professionalization, but that this aspect of driving toward a bottom line and the drive toward acquisition of resources, what does that do to our institutions and the way that they are conflicted in how they achieve those social value objectives? I think it's fair.
And I think there was actually a hospital that was declared that had been nonprofit.
Correct.
Which lost its status. Nathan, do you want to jump into that?
Well, I mean, I don't want to go too far on the road, but it almost seems as if there's a willful intent in some cases to blur the lines and to not even have a regulatory mechanism to make the determination. So we've got a category of our tax code called 501c4 organizations, which are social welfare. The definition of social welfare is unclear, and it turns into a catch-all category. And there have been some recent attempts to regulate the activities of social welfare organizations to say, well, we want to ensure that they're not engaging in campaign activities. So the IRS was proposing a rule that part of which would have affected 501c4s to say any political activity within 60 days of an election is now election-related political activity, and therefore we're going to treat it in a different way. And there's been a tremendous amount of resistance even to a rule like that one to monitor the activities within a certain time frame. So that's only one example, but it does seem as if there's an effort to blur the distinction and to make it impossible to tell whether some organizations are fulfilling truly nonprofit or charitable purposes, which to me is a frightening development. I mean, similar trends might occur with religious organizations that are charitable, potentially engaging in some sort of campaign activities, and because that is a black hole for us as far as information, we don't really have much data on our religious congregations in the United States. It's a huge potential vehicle by which they can intrude into political processes, etc., in a way that we wouldn't necessarily want charitable organizations.
I mean, political or commercial. I mean, you think about the religious entities and the commercial activities that they're engaged in and the way that they operate and function. I mean, we find example after example of charitable, nonprofit churches functioning in ways that are highly commercial.
Absolutely, and regardless of perhaps your political predispositions, you could see from either perspective why you might want to have the regulatory mechanism in place. You know, it threatens both the market and potentially public good, whichever one you tend to lean toward most as your primary interest, you're under threat. So the regulatory mechanisms, that's the part that does frighten me a bit in the U.S. It's not so much where the standards are set, but that we have the monitoring to enforce the standards that we agree on. And when I see the monitoring mechanisms being broken intentionally, it's a bit terrifying to think of where it'll go and what it'll do in the long run related to trust in the sector.
I mean, the piece of fragmented systems, a turning to and a reliance on nonprofit entities. So we've been doing some work with this Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. So this is a nonprofit organization that's responsible for all of the domain names that exist around the world. Right? So this isn't a government entity, this is a nonprofit organization. And then questions about who's in control, who governs this organization, and whose rights do we perceive as being appropriate to sit in the seats around the governing table, and it's not clear, right? And what regulatory entities exist, and yet a nonprofit is really it's a fascinating space.
Right, it's just such a naturally weak accountability between the actual public and the board representing the public's interest. There's a lot of potential for slippage.
And you think of the forces, the economic drivers in that space, there are clearly powerful stakeholders that want influence over that kind of area. It's just one example.
We found that our MP&L class quite likes to talk about political activities and the regulation thereof. We're seeing in the U.S., Trump signed the executive order to repeal the Johnson Amendment, which when became President Johnson, when he was senator, signed an amendment that restricted the mixing, particularly of religions in partisan activities. And in Canada, we've had a recent consultative panel on political activities that the government said it would report on soon. Do you see, so the prediction in the US is that we're going to see even more partisan engagement by charities and nonprofits. Is that something, for example, Hilary, that you see happening here? Have we politicized in a very partisan way? Is it likely that we would follow that trend of much greater? Do you see foundations wanting to go that route, for example?
No, definitely not. I think, and I said this earlier actually today, I mean, I think it's unfortunate that the word political is being used to describe the kind of activity that CRA is trying to regulate. It's not political in the conventional sense that anybody would understand political to mean, that is associated with a political party or partisan. In fact, as you all know, because you've all had the class, I guess, you know that partisan activities are defined separately and are banned. And there is nobody in the charitable sector that challenges that at all. I think that the debate that's been going on in the sector and with the government is one that has more to do with the right and responsibility of the charitable sector to speak out, to engage in public policy discussion, to help citizens engage in discussions of public policy. And there's been a pretty strong case made that there's a moral obligation on the part of the charitable sector as a whole, because it is a sector that in general is devoted to the public good, that it should be engaged to the extent that your mission and your mandate warrant it, that it should be engaged in policy work. And I think the frustration that the sector has been feeling with the federal government is that there's been too much focus on regulation of micro activity and a complete missing of the importance of the sector itself as a contributor to, facilitator of, convener of discussion across our country around policy issues. So I think there's a very strong feeling that the charitable sector should be, and foundations, not all, of course, but many foundations share the view that public policy is important, that the capacity of the sector to participate in public policy work should be reinforced. There are public policy training programs in the country now that are being funded by foundations because they believe that sector organizations should have that capacity. And it's not considered political. It's not in the sense that we are either intervening in the work of political parties or that we are trying to replace government in any way. I think it's more because so many charities actually do work that is relevant to policy development, and that policy development is poorer when it doesn't take advantage of the insight and the frontline experience of so many charitable organizations. But I'll just say one more thing on this. I feel that there are politicians, and whether they were in the Conservative government or they are in today's Liberal government, there are politicians who think, and many of them are in the cabinet, who think that the role of charities essentially is a 19th century role, a 19th century view of charities. So as long as charities are delivering services, as long as they're, to be really basic about it, as long as they're handing out blankets to poor people, as long as they're ameliorating poverty, but certainly not trying to prevent poverty, then that's okay. They're doing the right thing as charities. But as soon as charities become anything other than that, somehow they're usurping the right of government to determine what is appropriate and what should be public policy. And I think the whole idea that charities have a fundamental role to play in policy development is missed. So I'm a little disappointed, frankly, that this government is still not willing to go deeper. That they think that basically by having a discussion, a consultation on political activities and asking a group of people from the sector to be on a panel and issue a report, that checks their box. And of course, they've also stopped the audits. That's a good thing. But by taking away the pain and by having the consultation, that they've dealt with the issue. And they haven't dealt with the issue. They haven't dealt with it at all. So I think that this is something that we're going to hear more about. There's a whole effort being made by a group of sector organizations to try and lead a campaign to modernize the charitable regime so that we're not dealing with the 19th century anymore, we're dealing with the 21st century. Let's see if they listen. Talk to Mr. Trudeau. Anytime you see him at the next rally, instead of his socks, you want to talk to him about modernizing the charitable regime. And that's political activity. I issued a call to action to you guys. I'll declare it. It's under my 10% still.
Well, where do you see this? Where do you see an increased partisanship, if that is a future direction in the U.S.?
So I'll talk a little bit about an example of a group that I've begun to work with. It's called the Texas Education Grantmakers Advocacy Coalition. So a relatively young group of probably 5 to 7 years ago, they established with an objective around public education in the state of Texas. It happened back in 2011 when there was the tremendous cuts to public education and a real outcry from the foundations around something has to be done and there has to be a voice and a coordinated voice. And I think when they began, there was a lot of trepidation about where, as a foundation, can we act in this highly political space around how do we fund public education in the state of Texas. They've gone through a number of legislative sessions. As a good red state, we try to keep our legislature to a minimum. They only meet every 2 years. And so there's a cycle, a pattern of how long we let politicians stay together. And so they've been very purposeful about thinking about this cycle and pattern and becoming what's been interesting in the last couple of years, and in particular even this year, is the increased appreciation from relatively modest, I would say, foundations from the 19th century in some of these rural regions of the state, really coming to appreciate and understand the work that this group is trying to do, and really believing about bringing their trustees to understand the political space about how they need to participate in a policy context. So it's been fascinating to me to see some really pretty reserved foundations that tended to function fairly conservatively in their own distributing and functioning the way that Hilary summarized there, really appreciating that they are concerned about public education and that there is tremendous value in trying to work together. And it turns out that this is not a common way that foundations function and operate. And so to see this group functioning effectively, growing, having more influence, and trying to be more strategic about the work that they do does, to me, potentially signal some interesting work of foundations to try and be more engaged in that space.
Before we open it to questions, I want to focus for a moment on tax deductions and their implications. And Joanna's already queuing up. The Obama administration made 7 attempts to reduce the tax deduction for a whole variety of reasons. Arguably, Canada has the most generous system of tax incentives for charitable giving in the world. Do you see that same discussion, and Trump has signaled he'll move in the same way. Do you see that same discussion about the generosity of the tax incentives coming to Canada? It could be tied to the question of privilege, or is this a U.S. specific debate? And if it did come to Canada, what implications would it have?
So, I mean, as I mentioned, the tax rules for charitable giving are very generous in Canada, and but they are under review. So I'm not sure that we're going to see them decrease the benefits, but I don't think they're going to make them more generous. And what you do have in the U.S., which we have been lobbying for quite some time, is the elimination of capital gains for donating private company shares or shares of real estate. And of course, Don Johnson, who's affiliated with Carleton, has done lots of lobbying, as well as government relations committees of Canadian Association of Gift Planners. And when the Conservatives were in power and the lobby groups would go talk about this proposal, they would agree, they would say it's a fantastic idea, and we'd all be very positive, and then the budget day would come and nothing would happen. And it was very, very frustrating, because there are a lot of assets tied up in private company shares and in investment property. in the discussions with the current government about eliminating the capital gains on these assets, they're actually just saying, no, we're not doing it. So don't even get excited about budget day. Like they've been told, Don Johnson's been told, we're not doing it. So they are studying to see if they need to make the rules, or if they are too generous. I would be shocked if they did something to make them not as favorable, but I would be more shocked if they provided new incentives like the ones that we've been asking for. So I think we're pretty safe.
Let me open it to questions from the floor, things you want to ask, and our student Sylvie will run a microphone.
Tim's got a question.
Oh, sorry, Tim.
Right up here.
Up here.
Thank you, all of you, for your comments. A couple of quick questions. One has to do with the role of foundations as funders of charities. I'm on the board of a couple of charities, and one of the recurrent complaints is that as foundations have become more organized in Canada, perhaps more professional, they have adopted their own mission statements, their own goals. They are allegedly more strategic in their funding, but in fact it's making it very difficult for a lot of organizations that traditionally have relied on foundation funding to qualify for grants, which is a problem because many United Ways, which really are the source of the kind of core funding of organizations at the community level, they're having difficulties. We've talked mostly about organized philanthropy here, but the giving patterns to United Ways are certainly problematic in many places. So there's a crunch in terms of many organizations that depend on foundation grants. The second point was just to come back to the discussion about advocacy and political role. You know, there's a growing literature in the United States very critical of foundations. Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, Callahan's book on wealth and privilege, the book on the Gates Foundation, No Such Thing as a Free Gift, and so on. Editorials in the New York Times. It really has become an issue, I guess, because people have said, you know, we laud the generosity of donors. We don't ask questions about the system that allows them to amass such extraordinary fortunes. So I guess it raises a question about the role of foundations, particularly in the U.S., where I think there's clear evidence that much of the undermining of the democratic system has been funded by foundations. We haven't seen that, as Hilary pointed out, in Canada. But I think in Canada, perhaps it's partly because we don't have yet, and hopefully won't have, the polarization we see in the U.S. So that foundations generally are all pretty much in the mainstream. Mm-hmm. But as you pointed out, Hilary, you know, the line that the CRA draws between alleviating poverty and preventing poverty shows that the question of what is political, what isn't, is still very open to debate. Mm-hmm. So what worries me, I guess, is there are issues that could be polarizing in Canada, and I'm thinking of the whole challenge of a new relationship with Indigenous people, or the pipelines, or, I mean, there are a number of issues where perhaps that polarization could come here, and then I think the question of, you know, the role of foundations really driving the polarization, as we've seen in the U.S., becomes much more of a challenge.
Yeah.
Anybody want to comment on that?
I'll tackle both. Briefly, I'll try and be brief, allow for more questions. But I mean, on the question of foundations, should they be funders primarily? You know, you can answer that question differently. You know, foundations have resources that they can make available to the community. I mean, by definition, foundations have more resources than community organizations do. And so I think the question really is then, how do they make those resources available most effectively? You know, I think that private foundations in Canada can actually, there's no reason, no law, no regulation that prevents a private foundation, as you know, Tim, from deploying 100% of its revenues on its own programs. There's nothing that prevents a private foundation from doing that. So in that sense, there's really nothing that separates a private foundation from an operating charity, if it so chooses, other than the fact that it has money of its own to deploy. And I think that private foundations that are operating that way, and there are very few of them still, but if they are operating that way, I think that they should be under the same obligations as any operating charity, which is that they should be transparent about what they're doing. They should be very clear about communicating what their theory of change is, how they're going about it, what their decision-making processes are. They need to be open and they need to be accountable. So I think it really comes back to very good governance. And I think that I would suggest that foundations that are thinking about doing that are ones that should also be thinking very hard about diversifying their boards. Their boards should be not made up of a whole group of related people, not a family, but of people who are representing the community. And when I come back to the Chagnon Foundation, actually, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a foundation that is not dominated by its family. It's $1.8 billion, I think, now in assets. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, family foundation in the country, but it's not being controlled by the family. 4 people out of a board of 9 are family, and the rest are from the community or from outside the foundation. And I just think that's really important. I think paying attention to governance, to your structure of accountability, to the degree to which you are prepared to be open about what you're trying to do, I think those are crucial elements. So I'm not saying that foundations are going to, I don't think there's going to be a big trend in Canada towards foundations becoming operating charities. On the whole, I think most foundations are still operating as conventional funders and are using grants as tools. I'd like to see more foundations, frankly, using impact investing as a vehicle. There are assets that could be deployed that can be deployed in ways other than through grants. But impact investing has its own series of questions, which we won't get into now. I'll try and tackle the other question, and just by saying briefly that I think that was a point actually that I was thinking about in relation to what I said earlier, that the soul searching that is going on in the American foundation community is taking the form of debates around how to open themselves up, how to change their own processes as organizations, as foundations, not only to bring more people onto their boards and to change their own internal processes, but also to be much more thoughtful about building capacity in community, about being out there supporting community organizations and then bridging. So doing more participatory grant making. In other words, instead of being the judge and the funder and perhaps the executioner, if you decide to withdraw the grant, actually sitting down with organizations from the beginning and saying, what are the goals we want to try and achieve together? Let's figure out what those goals are. Then let's figure out what resources we bring to the table. Community organizations bring their knowledge and their expertise and the work that they're doing to operate the program. The foundation brings the money, but they also bring connections. They bring a voice. They bring access to power. So put all that together and do something that is participatory as opposed to arm's length. And then I think you're operating in a way that is much more that it's certainly justifiable. It's also accountable, and possibly and hopefully it's going to be more effective at the end of the day. And the last thing is really the beneficiary, the relationship between funders, the organizations they fund, and the people who are served by the organizations that are funded. I think that relationship also is a critical one. And to the extent that foundations can be more mindful of beneficiaries, what they need, how their voices can be heard, how you bring them into the relationship, I think will dictate how effective foundations can be as players within a larger community setting.
Great, we have some other questions. Joe.
I'm unable to let a question about tax policy slip if I have an opportunity to ask one. So Hilary, we're talking about the future foundations, and you imagine a world where it sees pools of private money used for public good, which sounds an awful lot like tax revenue. So my question is actually, though, for our American guests, the Panama Papers revelations opened a lot more people's eyes to the use of tax shelters in a corporate setting. But when we talk about high net worth individuals using philanthropic structures as tax protection, was there a corresponding level of attention paid to that in the U.S. with the revelations, or was it strictly on the corporate side?
I didn't see high attention on
No, in my opinion, the salience of the sector, I mean, it doesn't rise to that level in the U.S. I mean, the scandal has to be of enormous magnitude to get that kind of attention.
Breakthrough.
So.
Shut down. Jessica.
Over the last few years, we've heard a lot about big bets being made in U.S. philanthropy. I'm just wondering, Joanne, you said that a lot of it is private here and happening, behind closed doors. I'm wondering, are you aware of any kind of big bets that are being made that we might not have heard of? And Hilary, as well, for you, is anything happening in the foundation world where people are taking big bets, but it just hasn't made the news?
You want to start, Joanne?
Well, I mean, I do see philanthropists making very significant gifts in Canada. So, I mean, how significant? I mean, not in the hundreds of millions, but I do see people making $10 million and $20 million and $30 million gifts and doing it really, really quietly. I go to a summit every September called Women Moving Millions. And it's a 501(c) charity out of New York. And to become a member, you have to commit to give not to that organization, but to give to organizations supporting women and girls a minimum of $1 million over, over a 10-year period. And they get together for a summit to network and provide educational. And then on the last morning, they have Women Moving Millions, the 501(c) charity themselves, solicit funds openly in an open environment to the members that are sitting there for their core. To basically allow them to do the work that they're doing. And we see these American women stand up and say, here's 100,000, I'm giving 50,000, I'm giving 200,000, and the Canadian women all sit there silently. But they will give. They will send an email after the event and commit their pledge. So there's a difference. We're doing things just, the way we do things in Canada.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think just quickly, I think if you mean by big bet, and I'm just interpreting here, but potentially also something that is systems changing. I don't think that's happening yet. I think there are some aspirations, which is one of the reasons why there's an interest in public policy work, because ultimately you can't change a system unless you get a government on side, especially in Canada. I think it's really important to be able to bring the government's resources and policy decision-making power to bear. No individual foundation in Canada is large enough to really change a system, I don't think, in a major way. Even in the United States, arguably, it's very difficult for foundations to change systems. But are foundations getting a little more focused, and are they trying to figure out what they can do more effectively that is more upstream, perhaps? Not down at the sort of the symptoms of the problem, but the roots of the problem. That's mixing the metaphor. But that you get the idea. Yes, I think there are more foundations doing that, and I think they're doing it because there are certainly more foundations talking to each other, networking with each other, and learning from each other, and collaborating with each other than there were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And that is part of the, I think, disruption of the model that's happening. So I do want to walk back a bit from my bold statement of a little while ago, because I think actually that foundations as organizations are likely to be around 25 years from now. They just may be operating in ways that are quite different than the way they operate now. And I think some of the basics around transparency and accountability and openness and collaboration and effectiveness, I think those things will all be different and better. That's the positive note, right?
Hi, David Sweener. For our U.S. visitors, I found I've interacted with a lot of philanthropies in the States for a long time. I find philanthropy is generally had, and I think the spirit of this room, far more of a social liberal approach. And the big U.S. philanthropies either are or rather quickly have become socially liberal. When we look at Robert Wood Johnson, Ford, et cetera, Rockefeller, people who gave the money who weren't that way, but it became that way. One of the things I see now, and you touched on it with the sort of the culture war aspect of what's going on, but also more money coming in earlier. we do have some very wealthy people with very different views. The Koch brothers being a really good example. And I thought that, sort of from a Canadian perspective, sort of thought, okay, they're just the personification of evil. But but when I was in Texas at Austin at South by Southwest earlier this year, I got talking to people from one of their foundations, and I actually came away impressed because they had a different view, much more of a free market sort of view. And some of the things they were doing, I was thinking, that actually makes a lot of sense. That might actually work. And so on the one hand, you've got that culture war aspect. They would not fit, the people from that philanthropy would not fit in very well in this room, I don't think. But because they have a different worldview, they might be able to think of solutions to problems other people wouldn't, or fund people who wouldn't otherwise be funded. So I've come out of that with a question of, how does this actually work? Is this like the other areas of culture wars where we're just going to battle each other, or is there something going on here where we're going to learn because of a diversity of approaches to something?
Yeah,
Want to take that one on?
Well, I don't know what. Yeah, that's a big one. It's a fascinating question, and in thinking about, you're right. We tend to see more the examples of more conservative foundations and the work that they do. So I'm thinking one again. I'm sorry for the Texas examples, but the Arnold Foundation, which is one that is not a part of the TGAC group, right? So it's not a part of the group that this advocacy coalition who tends to be advocating for other ways of thinking about public education systems, some of which are private enterprise sort of models. So they're outnumbered, I think, but I think the speculation really does open up. Will it be a forum for learning and thinking about social problems and social solutions in a new way? It would be fascinating to watch. I think that's my observation. I think you're right. I think they are thoughtful and purposeful and have intellectual arguments that have some validity that we probably should be listening to, in addition to what the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is talking about. So I would agree with that, your observations.
And Nathan's work on data will allow us to see more of a window in.
Yeah, hopefully. And I guess one thing that I think is we've solved social problems with liberal and conservative approaches in the U.S., and I don't think many people have a problem with successful approaches from either side of the spectrum. But again, the question is whether the organizations that might have contributed with policy solutions from a perspective are now driving the political process. And there was a point before whether Canada will become more polarized, and will polarization drive the change? And I guess I would caution us to condition our thinking a bit and wonder whether there's a cycle going on here, and if a little bit of polarization causes us to weaken the systems, that might prevent polarization from further weakening the systems, and then we end up in a cycle of despair, and eventually we get to the point where we are in the States, and the fundamental governing systems have broken down. Yeah, a bit of it. Yeah, depending. But these regulatory mechanisms are critical because they're what allow us all to function in a collaborative way if we have different perspectives, right? So those are key. I mean, I don't know a ton about microeconomics, but I know enough to realize that collaboration and cooperation work better when there's a regulatory mechanism in place. If you have some kind of common good, otherwise it'll be quickly diminished. So, I mean, that I think is the potential problem here. It isn't the fact that we have foundations offering solutions that are market-based. Our healthcare system that's become so controversial down there now is a very conservative solution, and people seem to be, at least now that there's a real fear of it of being diminished or eliminated, it's widely popular even with those who are very liberal in their predispositions. So I think the system angle is the part that I think is problematic.
Let me take one more question, and Christopher had a question, I think. And then I ask you, what's the one thing that worries you most about the future of philanthropy and nonprofit sector in either country? But Christopher.
Sure. My question is sort of related to the last bit of discussion. In some parts of Canada, we're starting to see some parts of the political spectrum very cynically and deliberately use organizations to drive dialogue around wedge issues that support their platforms. And they've taken this tactic from the U.S. and U.S. Style elections. So for those of us who are just starting to experience this and are starting to see an erosion of trust in the nonprofit sector as a result, how do you think we can address this in a way that respects these diverse viewpoints but maintains trust in the system as a whole?
Any thoughts on that?
If Will and I knew the answer, we'd be writing a book and selling it in the U.S., unfortunately.
Well, maybe you want to move on to some final reflections then, which you were up then to that. What are the things you've identified, some from the start, but are there any other things that we haven't talked about that we should be watching as potential signals for either positive or negative futures?
Well, I guess one thing we haven't talked about, maybe, Susan, is, and maybe something I fear, is a continuation of the trend towards hollowing out of organizations in the sector. You know, this problem of the starvation cycle, that charities in general have such difficulty covering their core costs that they end up funder tails wag organization dogs. I mean, people are stuck trying to satisfy the requirements of funders, and they lose track of their own mission, and they can't even pay for their core costs. They can only somehow deliver projects for funders. That is a real concern. I don't see enough funders paying enough attention yet to that problem. Certainly not in the United States or in Canada. And it's right through the sector. It's not just the organizations working on the ground. It's infrastructure organizations, networking organizations, convening organizations, the whole web that sort of holds us together as a sector. We're very fragile, and I don't see that improving much. In fact, in some ways, I see it getting worse. And I see a regulatory structure in Canada at the federal level that is now really impeding any sort of flexibility or innovation in the sector as we struggle with the funding question. It is very difficult for us to come up with new solutions when we're stuck in this regulatory straitjacket, where charity is here and business is there and you must not cross, and therefore charities have to worry about becoming offside, if they try and operate more like businesses. But, where are they going to get the funding? I think that issue of the hollowing out of the core is a really big one. We can be very ambitious about the sector becoming, even more engaged in policy work, but frankly, if they can't keep the lights on, then, what's the point?
Nathan, things that you think about?
Related to that point, I think in the U.S. we think of the charitable sector and nonprofits generally as needing to develop their human capital and professionalize. And I think that on that side of the border, some of the mechanisms that allowed that to happen have been weakened. Those resources that were allowing organizations to invest in themselves have been diminished. And I don't know if that's the case here in Canada. I just don't have enough information, but it would be really unfortunate if that were to occur, because I think the baseline level in either country probably could be raised. So hopefully there'll be continued investment in that in this country, because I think in the U.S. it's a big challenge. Organizations that used to be able to fund educational opportunities, professional development for their key staff, are less able to do so. It's not to say it doesn't happen, but on average, I think it's more difficult. So continued investment in people in the sector is something that I think is important and a concern.
Joanne, what
things
you're thinking about?
I guess a couple of things is we've seen a little bit of collaboration, but I think there needs to be a lot more collaboration among charities. there are 86,000 of them in Canada, and if you want to start a new charity, you put in your application to Canada Revenue Agency. They're not going to say, well, did you know that this organization is doing exactly what you say you're going to do? Why don't you join forces and become more efficient? And so we have seen some good examples of collaboration, to cancer organizations merging. In Calgary, there are about 7 organizations that are dealing with homelessness that have come together to do one campaign. It's called the Resolve campaign, and it raises money for all of them to tackle this one issue, which I think is actually brilliant. And the other thing that worries me is the conversations that I continue to have with people, donors, that want to judge the efficiency of a charity by how much money they're spending on administration, and that we have an organization who has declared themselves as the organization that's going to rank charities by looking at a couple of lines on their information return and base their whole ranking as good or bad based on some of these numbers. And so that worries me, because charities need to spend money to attract good people. Yes, you make less money in the charitable sector than you do in the for-profit sector, but if you want good people, you have to pay them. And then they need resources. They need computers that work. They need to work in offices that are efficient. They need to get their message out about the good work that they're doing, and this shouldn't be criticized. And it's some very smart, bright donors that will actually say, none of my money will go to any of that, and that's worrisome.
We've had a lot of conversations about that over the last 2 weeks. Will, what are you thinking?
I mean, I agree with all the comments that folks here on the panel have shared. So perhaps one, as an educator, as we look out at the students in the room, as we look at the programs like this and the multiple others that exist around in the U.S., I do see a lot of really motivated individuals thinking systematically about what's going on in the sector. I see increased sophistication in the way we talk about it, in the research that's done, the material that comes out. So I have great hope that we can continue to appreciate the nuance of the sector, that we increase the capacity, the professionalization of the sector, while also understanding the social value that the sector provides, the role that it plays. It's a difficult balance, but I think it's programs like this, programs that I participate in, that helps to prepare people to really understand the complexities of operating. And so I have hope for that. I don't mean to be set the hopes on those younger than me that we have left behind the mess, but I think in many ways it's great to see the way that the programs develop and what that can be. So that's one I keep my eye on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to interject just to say thank you, Will, for pointing out that what we started off today by celebrating particularly the people that we have been dealing with as students coming into our programs with great optimism, great abilities. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we want people not only capable, but also wise and understanding the complexities that we're dealing with. And I've heard data that are going to become more available, but how are they going to be used? By whom, and what inferences drawn, or what perhaps misleading ones drawn from a focus on overhead. I've heard confidence in the growth of philanthropy and the potential for greater philanthropy, but also the concern that the income inequalities that actually might make philanthropy greater might also undercut its legitimacy and lead to questions as to what is being addressed by whose money for who and who has accountability over that. So here, to both see the positive things and the negative things, I think actually means that we will be able to do better in the future and be more wise. It's also, I think, encouraging that our students go not simply into working for nonprofits, but also go working in government and the CRA and to be more informed and understanding of the sector while regulating it. They go into development offices and get a greater sense of the sensitivities and the needs from when speaking to potential donors of not simply focusing on programs, but focusing on sustaining the sector and improving its resilience. So I hope that the wisdom that you brought is also something that we can inherit and cultivate in our own students, and also in those with whom we deal, the practitioners in the audience, to whom we're very grateful that you're here. We'd also like to offer all of us a chance for a bit of hospitality, a bit of refreshment, and please don't wander off. Please join us in celebrating philanthropy, but also celebrating the understanding that you've helped us acquire today. Thank you very much. I'll see you out at the reception.